Hello and welcome to this video. I've just made a video where I've ranked the 10 greatest prog double albums, the real epics of prog. And number 2 I placed this album, where's my face there? Tales from Topographic Oceans by Yes. That came out in 1973 when prog was at its peak. An absolute masterpiece of progressive rock, but also an album that has got a reputation. When I was doing that list, I realised if I started to discuss this album in depth, that the video would end up being like an hour long. So I decided to create these 2 follow-up videos where I discuss the album that was placed at number 1, which was Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and the album that was placed at number 2, which is this one. This was originally number 1 on my list. This can be seen as being the high point of progressive rock, the mountain peak, because its vision and epicness is just so huge. But it's a troublesome album, so I'm going to discuss that here. This is going to be my sort of very personal take on this album. It's going to be quite an esoteric discussion about progressive rock and the nature of it, I think. So this album followed up Close to the Edge by Yes. Close to the Edge was Yes really reaching a new peak of progressive rock. You know, the question is whether Topographic Oceans surpasses that peak. I think that's the discussion for this video. So Close to the Edge is a bold statement for a mainstream rock band to make. It's got one epic on side 1, Close to the Edge, and then 2 smaller but still epic tracks on side 2. It should have been commercial suicide, but I think instead it goes on to be one of probably Yes's greatest albums, selling millions of copies. It's a phenomenon. This must have emboldened Yes at the time. Now the question is why was it such a huge success? You know, I can't imagine somebody pulling this off today. You know, to be able to make an album that has no singles on it, there's nothing you can really play off it to market it. The only way you can really understand this album is to sit down and listen to it. It's an experience. I think in the early 70s, what we had was we had moved in the 1950s, 1960s from film being the overwhelming artistic experience for most normal people to television. And television is small. It's not so much now. Now we've got these great big widescreen, you know, surround sound systems in our house. But back in the 70s, you know, we were tuning in to quite a small, you know, screen, often in black and white, with a mono sound, you know, coming out. And that was the experience that most people had. I think that by the 70s, that was a central experience. I mean, everybody would sit around and the family would be brought together around that. But also, you have the proliferation of really good hi-fi equipment at this point, and stereo sound. So the only experience you can have in your house of something that is epic, that is like cinematic, is music. And you could see that this becomes a thing. You know, people are proud of their hi-fi systems. I can remember in the 70s, my dad was very proud of his hi-fi system, and he set that up in, you know, the living room, and on the evening, you know, we would sit and listen to albums, and this music is all encompassing. It fills the room, and music can tell stories. And I think one of the great things about progressive rock, and one of the things that makes it different from, say, jazz rock fusion, is the fact that it tells stories, right? It's full of great melodies and great stories. It's operatic. And so people want albums that are going to do that. You know, we think in 1973, when this is at its peak, Think of an album like Tubular Bells coming out and selling tens of millions of copies because people want to buy into that experience. They want to be taken on a journey. And more to the point, they want to be told a story. Now, the story that's told by Yes is a very esoteric, ethereal, it's hard to pin down. But these tracks are held together by concepts. It's just we don't know what they are. John Anderson's vision is so ethereal, but he's up there singing, and there's a subject matter. So for Yes to just follow their artistic heart and make an album like that, which I'm pretty sure is what they did. They just wanted to do what they thought was creatively their want, and this is what makes, I think, progressive rock so important in the history of art and music. Is you suddenly had musicians. There's no commercial constraints on this music whatsoever. This is what I find so wonderful about it, and yet it was reaching a mainstream, and Close to the Edge is a perfect example of that. So I think Yes are emboldened by this. It's not like they go, right, let's really try and do the audience head in. I think they're thinking, oh my God, this is the way to go. We can really now do something on a huge scale, and all those elements, all those esoteric elements come to the fore. They're not there on Close to the Edge or Fragile, but on here they are. Now, I haven't got a clue what they are, so I'm going to have to pull out the album. And if you get the album here, which we haven't had on a Yes album before, we have a little essay, I assume from John Anderson, where he starts to tell a story. We were on tour we were in Tokyo on tour, and I had a few minutes to myself in the hotel room before the evening's concert, leafing through Paramahansa's Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi. I got caught up in the lengthy footnote on page 83. It described the 4-part Shastric scriptures, which cover all aspects of religion and social life, as well as fields like medicine and music, art and architecture. For some time I had been searching for a theme for a large-scale composition so positive in character with the Shastras that I could visualize there and then 4 interlocking pieces of music being structured around them. That was in February. 8 months later, the concept was realized in this recording. So John Anderson has come across this idea, and this idea is really a way of condensing everything or life, down onto an album. That is the scope of this album. All right, and so what we get is 4 tracks. We get Revealing of Sights of God, Dance of the Dawn. Then we have The Remembering, High the Memory. Right, then we have The Ancients, Giants Under the Sun, and then we have Ritual, Nous Sommes du Soleil. There's these 4 tracks which are based upon these 4, what was it? Shastric scriptures, is it a bridge too far? I don't know. So they go into the studio with this idea. Now, this must have taken a lot of selling to the rest of the band, and what's famously happened, I think, is the band were all up for this. Now we've got to remember that Bill Bruford's left the band at this point, and they have a new drummer, so this is another anomaly, another shake-up to the band that's happened. And so we have Alan White on drums now, with a completely different drum sound, a completely different approach to Bill Bruford, going in to make this epic, esoteric album. And Rick Wakeman always has a different vibe about him. There's a sense of humour to Rick Wakeman. There's a tongue-in-cheekness, not in the music. He's very serious about the music, but he's famous for sort of eating curries on stage. At this point, he's drinking a lot, very sociable person, and I just don't think Rick was on board as much as he should. So I think this could have well hobbled this album a little bit, and I think a lot of the negativity comes out of Rick's attitude towards this. One of the things that's interesting when you listen to it is that Rick Wakeman and all the musicians are really featured. And I think that's one of the things that doesn't get discussed, is that what I hear on here is there are features for Rick Wakeman, especially on side 2. On side 3 we have tons of Steve Howe. On side 4 there's tons of Alan White. There's tons of Alan White on side 3 as well. There's whole sections of these sort of organised electronic-y drum solos on there. You know, Steve Howe does tons of that sort of slide guitar playing. So they're also featuring themselves instrumentally. You feel that the band is fracturing into individuals rather than being a cohesive whole. So these are the sort of things that I think where the magic's not quite there compared to Close to the Edge, where all the elements are working together. You feel that the band are fighting only a little bit, but they're fighting against each other. Obviously, after this, we see that period where they all go off and make solo albums, you know, and you know, I think Chris Squire's album Fish Out of Water ranks alongside the Yes catalogue. You know, it's an essential listen. So they go in, and I think what we've got with this album is a little bit of infighting of people trying to maintain their position. And it's meanders a little bit, all right? So that's, I think, the element here that makes it slightly less cohesive than Close to the Edge. And of course, it's you know, an hour and 15 minutes of music as opposed to 40 minutes of music. This is a big thing to take on. But I really don't think it's lacking that much cohesion. As I've gone on to listen to it more recently, they are doing an incredible job, really. What you've got are extended solo passages, especially on the I think on the track, I can't remember these titles, they're too long-winded, The Ancient Giants Under Stunt. I think that's the track for most people. Now for me, when I got this album as a kid, that was my favourite track because I was a drummer and I just loved the way Alan White opened up with that and that funky sort of groove. I hadn't heard that in Yes before. I thought that was fantastic. So I never had that feeling as a youngster, but it was heavy going for me. Right, so let's park that there. A few years later, Punk comes out. And Punk, the critics champion Punk and the critics turn on Prog at this point. Now, I've always felt this is motivated by music critics. Really, their output is usually about themselves. They want to promote themselves as being the arbiters of taste, and they decide to change. You know, rock and roll has gone from a very visceral music form in the 1950s, and it slowly moved to this highly sophisticated form of music that we have on Tales of Topographic Oceans. Now, I would argue that the rock aspect of Yes is still there. They really rock. They really rock. You know, when they go for it with Chris Squire's big meaty bass sound and those big drums of Alan White on this album, they really rock. This isn't some esoteric, airy-fairy, you know, instrumental pseudo-classical thing. You know, this is a full-on rock band playing. But the rock is also intertwined with all these other influences from classical music, from esoteric, you know, sort of spirituality. All these things are in there. And I think the critics, they wanted to champion something that characterised innate genius. Critics always seem to want to champion this, you know, the music made by people that don't know what they're doing. You know, this goes back to, I think, that sort of middle class English view of the blues in the 1960s, which really created rock music. Not rock and roll, sorry, rock music in the 1960s, and the idea of going back to folk forms and going, look at the brilliance here. And I think the music critics like to be able to point that out because it makes them look good. Punk was definitely a reaction against the extravagances of not just progressive rock, but a lot of music at that time, you know. And I think, you know, musicians who weren't virtuosos wanted access to music making. I think that's all the case. We could get into the arguments of how much punk influenced prog, and I've done that on this channel, and I think the influence is huge, and I actually see punk as an extension of the progressive rock genre. It comes out of that genre, and it actually contains many elements that progressive rock also had. The primary one being, for me, with English punk, the English aesthetic, which that runs through that. The punk bands also, although they were going back to the visceralness of rock, the blues aspect and soul aspect of rock they were also denying, which the prog bands don't. You know, most prog bands at this period are dripping with soul and funkiness and grooviness, and I think that's something that's lacks from modern progressive rock, personally. So the punk artists are championed by the critics, and they turn on progressive rock, and there's two things that they turn on. One is the LP, because the LP is seen as the most sort of extravagant, over the top as a whole, and they turn on this album. This album becomes the sort of example of what is bad with progressive rock. And I can remember growing up that if there was ever a documentary on progressive rock, we would then get to hear the stories of this album, and, you know, the fake cow in the studio and the hay bales, and, you know, this over the top album that was just all sprawling and messy, and, you know, musicians just overreaching themselves. And I think that has tarred Tales from Topographic Oceans. Right, so more recently I got one of those little like Google things where you can say, hey Google, play me some progressive rock. And when we bought it, I plugged it in and I said, hey Google, play me some progressive rock. And the opening track of Tales of Topographic Oceans came on. Now, I haven't listened to this album for years, and so I didn't quite recognise it. I went, this is Yes, but what's this album? And I had the experience there, and I pretty much realised pretty quickly that it was the opening track. But for some time I was like, well, which one's this? You know, and what I heard was Yes at their peak, and being able to hear it, because this is so rare that you actually get to hear something objectively, where something catches you unaware, and this was one of those moments for me. And listen to it, I felt the overwhelming feeling that this album's been hugely maligned, and this is Yes at their peak, and it is very concise. And what we have are solo sections of the band. That's what my take on this album is. Anyway, I think it has been re-evaluated. It's now been championed as being one of Yes's greatest moments and one of the greatest moments of progressive rock. It ranked 2 on my list, and that was only because I think Lamb Lies Down is just slightly a greater, and I'm going to talk about that on the next video, where I get to talk about Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. But anyway, that's my take on this album by Yes. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you want to support me more, please, you know, have a look at my Patreon. There's a ton of content. I put so much stuff up there. There's so much interesting stuff up there if you like my channel. And I promise you there is, you know, loads of stuff there that you'll enjoy, and you'll be supporting me in doing this, which is greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you on the next one.